First of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me. It's a very prestigious conference, and I've learned a lot. And I just told Thomas that even though University of Helsinki and Northwestern University in the States where I work seem to be very different, I think the evolution of higher education is moving very much in the same direction. And I think you will notice that in my few slides, there's going to be a good amount of overlap with what Thomas just said. First, I want to say something about Korea. As was pointed out, I'm an economics professor. My first trip to Seoul was back in 1989 when I gave lectures at the central bank. I've been coming back almost annually ever since then. And to see this incredible economy blossom over the last 3 decades has been extraordinary. And as was pointed out by Thomas, the higher education system is indeed not just a model for the rest of Asia, but for the whole world. And if you don't believe that, just look at the data from OECD and other comparison groups about the percentage of adults with college degrees. I thought what I would do, let me turn the slides, is briefly give you, for a minute or two, an overview of Northwestern University, and then talk a little bit as an economist, not as my day job as a university president, but as an economist who works on labor economics, talk a little bit about how an economist would evaluate the success or the failures of a higher education industry, whether it's in Germany or Finland or the United States. But then mainly, I want to get back to, again, speaking as a labor economist, what do I think the fourth industrial revolution is going to mean for labor markets across the world, and very importantly, how should higher education institutions react to those changes? So very quickly, Northwestern's located, we have 3 campuses, a small one in the Middle East, where we do global media, mainly as a partner with Al Jazeera, very important news outlet for the 1.7 billion Muslims throughout the world. We have our hospitals and our medical school and our law school 12 miles away from our Evanston campus in Chicago. And it's a university that has a number, as any university does, as you'll see, research centers. And getting back to Thomas's point, they are increasingly interdisciplinary. So when we have an environmental studies center, just as I'm sure you have at Helsinki, economists are there, biologists are there, journalists are there, lawyers are there, other scientists, engineers are there. And we find that, of course, is the way you do research is very different than when I first began my academic career on the faculty at University of Pennsylvania way back in 1979. Then we were much more siloed, and as was pointed out, if you're going to get serious research support, in our case, mainly from the National Institutes of Health in the United States, it better be interdisciplinary. So whether it's nanotechnology, or as I said, the environment, or any other research center in increasingly astrophysics and the like, it's increasingly interdisciplinary. The main revenue source we have, and I don't know what it's like in Germany or in Finland, but our operating budget is $2.4 billion a year US, which makes us a fairly small to mid-size private research university. If you look at Harvard, you look at University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, those budgets are twice ours. But the single major contributor to that is sponsored research. It's our laboratories. And when I talk to our undergrads and our graduate students and our professional school students, they readily think that the funding in the university is all about them. But as you see, $677 million, you do the math, that's 28% of our budget is to keep our research labs open. And that's the one thing that even sometimes faculty and alumni don't understand, that we're major contributors to research output. We have 12 schools, very quickly. Maybe the best known is one of the places I'm honored to teach, the Kellogg School of Management, which is a business school. We also have the Medill School of Journalism. That's pretty well known, and a number of other schools as well. We attract students from all over the world. It turns out that 23% of our students are from outside the US. Undergrads, it's about 11%. which is very similar to the Ivy University average, and about a third of all of our graduate and professional school students come from outside the United States. Not surprising, you'll see that half of those students come from China. We're proud to say that about 10% come from South Korea as well. We also, just like any university, have a number of outreaches to the great universities here in South Korea in business and engineering and law and the like. So now that's enough with my little talking about Northwestern. Now I want to put on my hat, not as the president of Northwestern, but as an economist who studies higher education throughout the world. There are a lot of ways we make our case when we're talking to politicians and we're talking to other people who can control our future. We're quick to talk about the accumulation of human capital through education. We're quick, as I just pointed out, with our 28% of our budget to keep our labs open. We talk about research output. One thing that's often lost, and I don't know what the percentages are in Germany or in Finland or in South Korea, but at least in the US, there are 4,600 colleges and universities enrolling 20 million people. And if you add up all our budgets, I mentioned before the annual budget for Northwestern is almost $2.5 billion US. The total budgets for all those colleges and universities is $600 billion. That's 3% of all economic output in the United States. And when I talk to people in Washington, D.C. about the value of U.S. higher education, I always make that point as well, that we're one of the largest, not only one of the most important industries, but one of the largest ones as well. And I think that's an interesting fact to try to figure out for all the different countries, especially in South Korea. If you look nationally at all of those universities, as I mentioned, 20 million students studying in the United States today, 5% of them, or 1 million, come from outside the United States. We heard from this morning a wonderful, inspiring talk from the former Prime Minister of Australia when she mentioned that Australia is a major net exporter of educational services, bringing many more international students to Australia compared to the Australians that study abroad. That's nothing compared to the United States. When you actually look at the numbers, it's one of the few things we have left in the US that we're in fact a net exporter, and we're the world's largest net exporter of educational services. It's not surprising. Thomas gave you a slide from the Shanghai rankings, and he pointed out that 50 of the highest rated 100 universities in the world are located in the United States. If you look at the top 50, once again, Thomas, is 25. So it's not surprising that students from all over the world not only are eager to go to Germany and to Finland, but to the United States as well. Now, this slide is an important slide for any economist, and I don't know whether in Germany and in Finland and in South Korea, you are increasingly asked to explain whether your colleges and universities are engines of income and wealth mobility or not. I think most people are aware, certainly a lot of economists have been very clear about this, that since 1979, in the United States and in Western Europe, the movement towards increased income and wealth mobility stopped. Nobody expected it to stop. If you look at the US, and I've done a lot of work on this myself, from 1900 to 1979, income mobility went up, wealth mobility went up, and as a consequence, the degree of inequality in distribution of wealth and income really went down. The world changed in 1979. In 1979, there was an intense increase in income and wealth inequality. So in the United States, I'm constantly asked as an economist, much less as a president, what do those universities do to ensure mobility? If you enroll a student from a relatively disadvantaged background, what's the probability that that student will end up near the top of the income distribution? There's a brilliant economist named Raj Chetty from Stanford who did some fantastic work, and this summarizes some of it. He asked the following question, and I would love to have the comparable data for Germany, Finland, South Korea, and the rest of the world. He asked the following question: if you were born in 1980, what's the probability, and you grew up in the bottom 20% of the American income distribution. That's income below, in today's dollars, $21,000. So you grew up among the bottom 20% of American households. What's the probability that when you reach age 32 in 2012, you're going to be not in the bottom 20%, but the top 20%? That top cutoff is 104,000. So again, this is a really important question I think everyone should ask, especially everyone involved in higher education. If you grow up in the bottom fifth, what's the probability that you're going to end up in the top fifth when you're in your early to mid 30s? It turns out that number for the United States is really very low. You only have an 8% chance, okay? 8% chance, fewer than 1 out of 10, to grow up in the bottom and end up in the top. However, if you have a higher education degree, that probability is 21%. If that degree, so rather than 8%, it's 21. What if that degree is from one of the great public institutions, the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, the University of Wisconsin, Madison, one of the University of California schools, one of University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, then it turns out the probability of going from the bottom to the top over that part of your lifetime is 42%. And then finally, the most amazing and gratifying statistic is, what if you go to one of the Ivies? What if you go to Georgetown? What if you go to Duke? What if you go to Stanford? What if you go to University of Chicago? What if you go to Northwestern? And that's the number there. You have a 52% chance, if you're lucky enough to enroll in one of those schools, to go from the bottom fifth to the top fifth. Now, is that going to continue over time? It really depends on what the fourth industrial revolution does to labor markets. And it turns out that there are two of my colleagues, they happen to be with me in the economics department of Northwestern, who are the leading debaters on the future of what the fourth industrial revolution is going to do to income mobility, to economic growth, to labor force changes, and to what higher education universities need to adapt. On the left is Bob Gordon. Robert Gordon wrote a book, and I'll show you the book right here. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. It's a best-selling book, and he argues that the historical growth rates in the American economy, which were 2% a year adjusted for inflation, and that's the growth rate from 1870 in the US to 2007, that 2% growth, and if you know the rule of 72, the rule for compound interest, that means the economy doubled every 35 years. He now says that the average growth rate adjusted for inflation going forward is going to be less than 1%. So rather than the economy growing every 35 years, it's going to grow in 75 to, actually, if it's 0.8 growth rate, it's 90 years. On the other hand, on the other side, let me go back to that, from that thing, is Joel Mokyr. And Joel Mokyr has a very different view. He looks at technology and he says, technology creates jobs. It creates economic growth. And in fact, his estimate of the future of the economy is very, very positive. So I don't know who's going to be right. The Australian Prime Minister asked that question. She said, this technological change, it leads to automation. What's going to be the future of jobs? And very importantly, what's going to be the future of higher education institutions that prepare people for those jobs? So nobody knows for sure. As an economist, I was intrigued at the beginning of the conference this morning when the host said that the weather today was clear and it's beautiful and clear, and that's going to be what you come out of this conference with, a beautiful and clear path for the future. But the reality is it's very, very difficult to tell, again, whether technology is going to be labor enhancing or whether it's not. So as an economist, I've thought a lot about this, and for my last 6 minutes, I want to talk specifically about what I have found in my new book that also recently came out and other people's work. And it specifically is about the fourth industrial revolution. And there you have some lines from the head of the World Economic Forum. In the future, talent more than capital will represent the critical factor of production. And then he lists a whole range of things, not different than some things Thomas mentioned and other speakers this morning: robotics, nanotechnology. I mentioned quantum computing, and the like. And what does that mean for higher education? Nobody knows for sure. Here's some speculation consistent with what Thomas said. Maybe a decrease in international student mobility, probably, as he said, a decrease in human instructors, probably an increase in interdisciplinary teaching, in digital platforms, and access to digital education. In conclusion, I have 5 things about the future, and I once wrote a book about why it's so hard to predict the future. We heard from the Prime Minister about one futurist who got it right. I argue in that book that if enough people make predictions, somebody's going to get it right. It doesn't necessarily mean they have an inherent model for how the economy works or the transitions based to labor force based on technology. If you predict enough things, one of them is going to come right. So I don't know for sure about that. But here are my 5 things. I don't have a slide about it. These are my 5 most likely predictions as a labor economist with expertise in American higher education. And the first one, again, is Thomas's, that whatever happens in terms of robotics and the like, interdisciplinary research and teaching are going to become more important than ever. And if you have those silos, and I love that picture looking from Iowa or Nebraska of those silos, that's the old model. And if you don't break down those silos, you're not preparing students for the world in which we're going to send them. That's number 1. Number 2, creativity is at a premium, and several people mentioned that. We just had the reaccreditation team for our engineering school at Northwestern, and I was really struck that in their report they said our approach to engineering, which might be different than some approaches in Korea and elsewhere, is really design engineering. It's much less on the technical skills, and it's much more on creating creative people who are entrepreneurs. And I think that's my second point. Creativity is at a premium. If you're thinking about worrying about going into a profession that could be outsourced to Hyderabad or somewhere else or somewhere in China, creativity cannot be outsourced. And I think it's more important, the burden is on higher education institutions to make sure that we don't just teach narrow technical skills, but we teach creativity. The third thing is cultural literacy, another thing you touched on, Thomas. I teach econ math. I get a lot of Asian Americans and a lot of international students because they go there and they come to Northwestern and they're very interested because I'm an econometrician. They want to learn those skills. And I can tell you that every week somebody comes to my office and they say, President Schapiro, Professor Schapiro, give me another course I should take. What's another math course? What's another statistics course? What's another econometrics course I should take? And I say, where do you want to work? And you know what they say? I want to work in South Korea. I want to work in India. I want to work in Vietnam. I want to work in Indonesia. I want to work in China. And you know what I tell them? Stop taking so much economics, so much statistics, and so much math. What you should take, if you're interested in South Korea, take a course in Korean history, Korean politics, Korean religion, Korean literature, God forbid, Korean language, Korean art, Korean music. That's the cultural literacy that pays off now in the 4th Industrial Revolution. Number 4, I used to say when I first became a professor in 1979 that if I get it right, I'm going to train my students to work in a certain job category in a certain industry and realize that that student's probably going to change jobs 3 or 4 times throughout that person's career. That's not the case now. We're not training people to change jobs within a profession. We're training people for multiple professions. So my students come up to me and they say, I'm going to start off in teaching. I'm going to do Teach for America. And then I'm going to law school. Oh, you want to be a lawyer? No, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a business person. So if you think about the skills somebody needs for teaching, for law, for business, and on and on and on, those are very different skills than one would expect with the narrow technical training that I got when I was in college in the early to mid 1970s. My 5th thing and my final point, and I still have 38 seconds right on time, is exactly one thing that Thomas said. You know, people ask me all the time as a university president, what's the greatest outcome you want for your postdocs, for your professional school students, for your PhD and master's students, and most importantly, perhaps, for your undergrads? Is it, being able to tell the difference between alternative facts and real facts? Is it to be quantitatively adept? Is it to have aesthetic appreciation? And I say no. The most important thing we want from our students, because this is what you need with a changing, flattened and changing, enhanced technological world, is one, the ability to educate yourself for a lifetime, which is exactly what Thomas said. When I graduated college, and even when I got my PhD, I knew so much less about the world than I do now. And you want to make sure that the students have that nimbleness, they have that flexibility, they have the skills to educate themselves for a lifetime. The most important thing, though, isn't to have those skills, it's to have the humility to know that you're only beginning your education when you graduate university. Thank you.